Hi everyone. Thank you very much for being here today. My name is Patricia. To do a quick sensory description, I am a Hispanic woman in my late 20s. I wear glasses and I have black hair. My accent is a mix of Spanish and Scottish, and I use she, her pronouns. Before the webinar starts, I will go over some housekeeping. I will tell you more about the event structure. First of all, we are thankful to have human-generated captions at the webinar today. You can turn this on by clicking the CC button at the bottom or by clicking the link in the chat. Please note that we are recording this event. You are welcome to comment in the chat and put any questions for our panelists or the SUK in the Q&A box. We understand technology will sometimes be temperamental, so don't worry if you have to disconnect and reconnect. You can always direct message someone from the SUK if you are having any trouble. We will start today with a 30-minute presentation of the report. We will then take a 5-minute break. Our panelists will then speak for 20 minutes, and then we'll kick off the panel discussion. After another 5-minute break, we will open up for questions from the audience. Our first speaker today will be Matteo Stander, the founder of Disabled Students UK. Putting lived experience and evidence-based approach at the heart of our mission to improve accessibility, the SUK has rapidly become the largest disabled student-led organization in the UK. The SUK works on 3 levels: empowering disabled students, conducting research and consulting to share disabled students' insight, and informing policy. In the 2 years since our creation, the SUK has consulted with a number of sector stakeholders and decision makers, spoken at the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Disability, delivered training for the National Union of Students, and had one of our reports mentioned in Parliament. We have been recognized by Show Trust as one of the most influential disabled-led organizations in the UK. Our aim is to achieve truly accessible higher education experience, ensuring disabled people equal access to education and the societal and self-development opportunities associated with this. Now I will hand over to Mette. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Let me do a quick sensory description. I'm a white person in my late 20s. My accent is a mix of Swedish, American, and British. I use all pronouns. I'm delighted to see so many here today. Before we get into the topic of the presentation, I want to just start by taking a moment. I know there's a lot going on in the world right now. A lot of us are worried. So let's take a moment, take a few deep breaths, and recognize that we have this pocket of time where we don't have to think about the next thing coming up or anything else other than the question at hand. How can we use the lessons of the pandemic to improve accessibility in higher education going forward? We sent out a survey to disabled students in 2021 and received more than 300 responses from students across the UK. This provided us with incredibly rich data concerning how disabled students have experienced the pandemic. As current or recent disabled students ourselves, we're acutely aware of the time that these students sacrifice in order to answer this kind of survey. So when we started analyzing the data, we were thinking, how can we use these insights to make as large an impact as possible? As Patricia said, as an organization, we work on all levels, from student peer support to policy consultation. However, in this report, and by extension this event today, we decided to direct ourselves towards universities. In particular, we were inspired by the answer to the last question in our survey. What lessons do you hope that your university learns from the pandemic to become more accessible moving forward? We want to provide a guide for how the sector can move toward a more inclusive higher education provision. I'm just seeing that someone's asking for a link to the report in the chat. If someone could copy that in, it's on our Disabled Students UK website. To look at where we want to go, it's necessary to look at where we've been. So let's start with the bad news. In our survey, 57% of students stated that they had considered interrupting their studies or switching to part-time studies due to the pandemic. Thinking that this leaving consideration rate must be high because of the pandemic, we looked at earlier comparison figures. It turns out that Randstad found a similar figure in 2019, before the pandemic. In other words, the pre-pandemic baseline for disabled students is not good. It's important to talk about this because it clarifies why we cannot go back to normal. A norm where people were not socially isolated and everyone had access to on-campus education never existed. It's a mirage. One way that one might rationalize the high leaving consideration rate is to say that disabled students leave as a natural consequence of their impairment. If this were the case, we would expect those with certain disabilities to be much more likely to leave than those with other disabilities. This is not borne out in our data. What we find instead is that disabled students are much more likely to leave if they state that their university didn't consult with them about their access needs, didn't share enough information about disability-related processes, didn't prioritize the accessibility of their courses, and didn't give them the support they needed. We should mention that the risk of considering leaving is not the same for all disabled students. Students in poverty, students from a low socioeconomic background, and shielding students were all especially likely to consider leaving. These same groups were also especially likely not to receive the support they required, along with EU and international students. So luckily, the pandemic has given us many tools to move forward instead of sliding backwards. The first of the lessons we can learn from the pandemic has to do with anticipatory action. As you probably know, the Equality Act states that higher education providers must take an anticipatory approach to accessibility in order to be able to provide disabled students with the same access as non-disabled students. But I'm not sure higher education providers always realize just how effective taking a proactive approach is. The pandemic has given a clear example of this because despite the difficult circumstances, the chaos in the move to online learning and the delays in support, on average, teaching has been more accessible to disabled students during this time compared to before the pandemic. This is because a few universal measures, such as lecture recordings and alternative exam formats, have significantly improved accessibility for many disabled students. 85% of our students state that they would benefit from having the option of online learning for some or all of their teaching going forward. Now, what we're suggesting here is, of course, not that we stay in crisis mode, but rather that we build on what's worked well. Many disabled students have benefited from lecture recordings and a reduction in the physical discomforts of attending in person. So let's incorporate that into normal provision. Let's also expand the number of courses that can be attended entirely online. This would allow us to better accommodate those who are clinically extremely vulnerable and still unable to safely attend in person. The wider point here, though, is that by adjusting their provision for all students, universities accidentally accommodated large groups of people, including many disabled students that would otherwise have struggled to access teaching. This is the power of building accessibility into provision for all. Our key recommendation here is that universities proactively create a strategy for accessibility, which covers all aspects of the disabled student experience, from supporting applications to the disabled students allowance to enabling accessible teaching. By taking this proactive approach, effective institution-wide adjustments like the ones we've talked about can be found and implemented. Just checking that I'm speaking at a pace that works for everyone. Would anyone like me to slow down? Pace is good, cool. The second lesson came to us as we were trying to understand why, when most students found online delivery more accessible, only 23% of disabled students stated that they have received the disability support that they require. First of all, we should say that we don't know if this figure, 23%, is as low as it is because of the pandemic, or if it was always this low. We haven't been able to find this question asked anywhere else in the literature, so we can't compare with pre-pandemic conditions on this one. Putting this aside, it is a low number, and we came up with some reasons why this might be. First of all, and related to the last point, it seems that accessibility was not proactively considered in the switch to online learning. A 2021 study by Ivan Newman found that only 15% of universities stated that they had given their lecturers advice on how to make their teaching accessible to disabled students. Of our participants, only 5% stated that the university proactively consulted disabled students on how to make sure new teaching methods were accessible to them. It's no wonder, then, that despite finding it more accessible on average, a majority of our participants have also experienced some accessibility issues with online learning. The qualitative data showed that part of the reason for this poor support was that some staff members struggled to understand that one size does not fit all, and individual adjustments were still necessary. One student writes, "I have repeatedly had to chase up all of my access arrangements and justify them anew because staff thought I no longer had need for them, when in fact I needed them more." The key takeaway here is that even when universities implement practices rooted in universal design, staff needs to be provided with training and resources to implement these in an accessible way, and to provide individualized support when needed. As part of their proactive strategy, universities need to appropriately resource their staff. This includes providing the funds and advanced training required by staff that have a primary responsibility for accessibility, whether that's in student support services, estates, digital accessibility, the academic departments, and so on. However, equally as important is providing obligatory training and clear guidelines on accessible digital and in-person teaching delivery to staff in academic departments. Our third lesson is best summed up by a quote from one of the participants. When asked what they wanted their university to learn, they responded that flexibility helps everyone, and strict pedagogical arrangements are not always the best way forwards, and that the conditions and parameters of academic learning can bend a lot before they break. Flexibility and understanding was the third most common lesson our students wanted their university to learn from the pandemic. This is important for disabled students in particular, because they sometimes encounter attitudes that block accommodations. For instance, there can be a fear that making accommodations will somehow devalue the degree. They also sometimes encounter suspicion regarding whether they really need the accommodation or are trying to get an advantage over other students. Both of these attitudes have been challenged by changes that have happened during the pandemic. Before the pandemic, practices such as online attendance and open book exams were sometimes rejected out of hand, with vague references to pedagogy or academic rigor. But during the, just double checking that everything is okay. Leah? Cool, sorry. But during the pandemic, these practices have come to be seen as valid, almost sometimes even superior options. Universities have had an opportunity to learn from this and become more flexible going forward, so that students that need to take in or demonstrate knowledge in alternative ways are allowed to do so. During the pandemic, we've also seen a move to less mistrustful policies around extensions and mitigating circumstances, where students have been allowed to self-evidence. Some students report a general culture of compassion, including increased understanding of mental health difficulties, ostensibly stemming from the idea that we're all struggling together in this. In fact, students with mental health disabilities were more likely to say that they had received the support that they required than any other disability group. These trends are fantastic, and we need to see how we can carry them beyond the pandemic context. Many of the struggles experienced by students during the pandemic, such as isolation or sudden health difficulties, are struggles experienced by disabled students during non-pandemic times as well. By drawing on this culture of compassion, universities have an opportunity to put mistrust aside and implement more inclusive policies going forward. The question of compassionate attitudes is closely related to the fourth lesson, that the administrative burden put on disabled students in order to receive support must be reduced. During the pandemic, the process of acquiring evidence and going through needs assessments has been delayed. This has been exacerbated when universities have neither put more resources into administrative processes nor reduced their evidence requirements. 28% of our participants stated that they'd been asked to provide additional evidence of their disability-related needs, despite having already proved to the university that they were disabled. Others experienced severe delays. One student comments, "I had to contact the disability people about 5 times to get the support put in place, despite me speaking to them several times and sending them my medical evidence. It only got put in place because my course leader emailed the disability team herself." The time and energy demands associated with this process, alongside the delays, have very real consequences for students. Students who've been asked for additional evidence were almost 3 times less likely to say that they had the support that they needed. This shows clearly that instead of making sure that support ends up in the right hands, the administrative process, in its current form, blocks access. We hope that universities learn from this and take steps to measure and reduce the burden, as has previously been recommended by the Higher Education Commission. It can be reduced by baking accommodations into provision for all, and thus avoiding an individualized process, as discussed in Lesson 1. However, there's also a number of adjustments that can be made to the process of acquiring support itself. For instance, the evidence requirements can be reduced, and a student-specific disability contact can be tasked with checking that accommodations which have been agreed upon are actually implemented, without the student having to chase this up themselves. The final lesson becomes clear if we zoom out to look at the pattern at play within the first 4. Disabled students had been requesting lecture recordings for years before the pandemic. As we saw in Lesson 1, this was suddenly implemented when abled students needed them. At the same time, Lesson 2 shows that disability-specific adjustments have been overlooked, ignored, or slowed down. In Lesson 3, we saw that some universities have provided blanket policies of leniency and reduced administration. In spite of this, Lesson 4 shows that the administrative burden for disabled students has persisted or increased. The overarching pattern is that disabled students are deprioritized and overlooked. This is especially clear for shielding students. One student writes, "I was shielding in halls. I had no support, no help, and no information. It was only when students came back in September that they put up signs and hand sanitizer. I felt alone and forgotten." Only 15% of our participants were happy with the communication that their university had put out for disabled students during the pandemic. And only 8% felt that their institution had prioritized making their course accessible for disabled students. Just as accessibility was often forgotten in the move to online learning, it has also been forgotten in on-campus safety measures. 41% of participants who had received on-campus teaching during this time stated that new access issues have arisen. Only 18% said that their university was proactive and efficient in addressing these. Several of our participants stated that disabled students have felt like an afterthought before and during the pandemic. When disabled students are so systematically forgotten, we have to look at the structures of responsibility within institutions. It's been argued in recent years that senior leadership claiming ownership is key to effecting change. We agree with this, but would add that staff across a variety of departments must be united under this leadership. Only when interdepartmental communication and structures of accountability are in place will the institution as a whole be able to truly take responsibility for disabled students' access. Seeing the pattern of disabled students being forgotten means seeing the risk that when the main beneficiaries of practices like lecture recordings are once again disabled students, these new forms of accessibility might disappear, and the progress that's been made could be lost. We're already seeing this happen in some institutions. However, seeing the pattern also gives us the tools to change it. In the post-lockdown world, no university can argue that they cannot provide online resources, cannot lower administrative barriers, and cannot apply compassionate policies. In this sense, going back is not a choice for higher education providers either. Luckily, as we've attempted to show, the pandemic has equipped universities with experience and capacity, which opens many routes forward. Universities are now more equipped for online delivery. They've experienced a greater variety of ways of sharing and assessing knowledge, and they can draw upon experiences of pulling together and cultures of compassion. By taking on the lessons of the pandemic and moving forward with a responsible, proactive, and compassionate approach, they have the opportunity to create an institution which, for the first time, allows disabled students to access education on equal terms. Now, before we go on a break, I want to talk a little bit about concrete next steps. Each lesson in the report comes with a number of recommendations, as well as names of service providers that universities can contact for support. So do check that out. Whether you're a student union representative, university EDI lead, or disability support manager, we urge you to share the insights of this report with senior leadership at your institution. For universities with more than 10 respondents, it's also possible to commission a report based on the data specific to that university. We're currently creating such a report for University of Plymouth, for instance. The second most common lesson students wanted universities to learn, we haven't actually touched upon yet. It was to consult disabled students. Students who were proactively consulted were 3 times more likely to have the support that they needed and more than 3 times less likely to consider leaving. If you share our values of using a lived experience-driven approach to reduce inaccessibility, I urge you to also consider joining our Access Insight network. Access Insight is a project designed to allow universities to benefit from the insight of disabled students. The project will measure disabled students' experiences within the institution to inform university leadership about areas of strength and challenges, as well as which accessibility policies are associated with successful outcomes. Pioneering universities that sign up to our Access Insight network make a financial contribution to the project and in return receive a yearly report on disabled students' experiences within the institution, including tailored recommendations, a monthly Access Insight brief with informative videos from lived experience experts designed to help you improve disabled students' experience, and 6 hours per year of DSUK consulting tailored to the university's key improvement goals. If you're interested in learning more, please fill in the form that we'll put out in the chat at the end of this event, or email us at accessinsight@disabledstudents.co.uk. Again, before we go on a break, I also just want to take the opportunity to thank our team. The DSUK research team has been working on this survey and report for more than a year now, and I'm very proud of what we've created. In fact, all DSUK volunteers have contributed to the report on some corner, and of course, our wider disabled student community and allies have been indispensable in their feedback. I feel incredibly lucky to be part of such a great community and such a great team. So we're now going to take a short break, and when we come back, our network director, Amelia McLaughlin, will introduce our panel. Please do submit your questions in the Q&A box in the meantime.
Hi everyone, it is now 1:40 and we will resume. Just as a quick start and as a sensory description, I'm a deathly white individual with curly ginger hair in a tight ponytail, and I'm wearing black rimmed glasses. I identify as female and use she, her pronouns. So next on our agenda today is the panel discussion and Q&A. I'm excited to introduce our 4 extremely knowledgeable panelists who will be telling us what lessons stick out for them and how universities can take them forward. Each panelist will be speaking for 5 minutes after my introduction. Please do, if you are an attendee, submit questions through the Q&A feature before the Q&A starts after their introductions. So first, Digital Accessibility Lead for the University of Westminster. He has previously worked with higher education and multiple levels of government. His recent research alongside the Thomas Pollington Trust, I hope I got that right, looked at the impact on disabled students within the UK colleges with suggestions for educational institutions which are applicable to higher education. And with that, I will pass on to George.
Thanks, Amelia. It's the Thomas Pocklington Trust, actually, but that's all right. Thank you so much. So I've had a great time reading through the various versions of the report so far. I really wanted to talk about lessons 1 and 2, which particularly stuck out in the areas I work in. So I want to talk about the anticipatory approach first. The greater expectation with this lesson is, for me, that we as HE institutes, higher education institutes, are ready for anyone who comes in that front door first time, as it were. We do have to, as has been said, have an anticipatory approach legally, and also it's the most effective way, in my opinion, that we can support the wide range of student requirements we get. Obviously, lecture captioning was mentioned throughout this lesson. This is obviously something I'm greatly in favour for having continue, along with a more comprehensive recording plan and continued captioning. This is a challenge for most universities to achieve at the scale required. I've worked with a lot of universities who are looking at tens of thousands of hours of lecture recording to capture everything and provide that consistent service. But I think now that this need has been identified, I can see more appropriate solutions coming down the pipeline. So I think that there is a challenge at the moment with delivering lecture captioning at scale, but it is one of my top priorities. I think that we do have to, as a sector, deal with. A couple of other examples of areas where I think this is something that we do need to deal with in a more anticipatory way. Comms and prospective student engagement teams being ready to deal with accessibility related questions, directing students to those right resources is something for me as well. I've recently been having conversations with some of my colleagues at Westminster, looking at our clearing processes, because we want to boost how we handle these types of queries, showing support from those first moments. Very time sensitive, very stressful time for all students, and we want to be able to make sure that we have those accessibility considerations ready to support whoever rings us up. Not only comms and directing students to support, but also the technology we have on hand needs to be right. Back when I was working with the University of Kent, my colleague who was there has recently just taken up the digital accessibility lead role at UCL. We tried to make a range of technologies available to everyone. This came out as a productivity tools list, which supported students in finding tools to help their learning in their own way. So a big favourite of mine was a tool called Census Access, which can help students convert documents to other formats, such as audio files, to have the text read out to them. That gained a lot of support, but I think it is important that we think about the library of tools we have at our disposal to support users however they want to learn, rather than someone coming to us with a problem and us having to work on a solution retroactively. At the core of this lesson for me, it's that us as higher education institutes are ready to be flexible and can support students through whether it's contact or learning routes that work for them. And talking about lesson number 2, about resourcing staff, this one is probably one of the lessons closest to my heart. As you mentioned, last year I completed a piece of research with Thomas Pocklington Trust into the disability support in further education for blind and partially sighted students. Many of those results were disappointing in several areas and did lead to recommendations that, unsurprisingly, align with those that will be coming out in this DS UK report. Digital accessibility services especially, but accessibility services in general, for a long time have not always been prioritised, fit for purpose, or funded suitably, in my opinion. I mean, the Lord Holmes report released last week attests to the current state of the Disabled Students Allowance. I personally am in a fortunate position to be leading a digital accessibility team. I have the resourcing and I have colleague and leadership buy-in at Westminster. There is a clear culture of care about this subject at the moment and a real impetus to improve and change. And this isn't the case for everyone. Many colleagues I know from universities all across the country got into dealing with recent changes to digital accessibility regulation requirements and improving our good practice simply because they showed an interest and nobody else was stepping up to the plate. An amazing amount has been done by the good intentions of those colleagues, but I worry we're reaching the limits of what can be achieved on that can-do attitude alone. Investment in staff training, as has already been mentioned, to help all staff deliver that absolutely bare minimum level of accessibility, I think is a must. We really should be getting this on everyone's continued personal development plans. Everyone really should be taking some accessibility responsibility in their job roles. I know University of Southampton actually has some stuff that's coming along that vein that I'm really excited to see when that comes out. Another thing is a strong stance on accessibility and procurement of digital systems that we're forcing staff and students to use is vital. Published resources as well is a struggle that we continue to need to have to make sure that we're buying in published resources and expecting publishers to deliver accessible content. Finally, I would suggest that in higher education institutes, investing in hiring and training digital accessibility experts, as you've already mentioned, and retaining those experts in-house, not just for a one and done project, but for the long run, is the right way to go. Accessibility requirements will continue to change, and universities will need skills there to help keep their organizations up to date, to help continue to support each new cohort of students. And keeping a small internal expertise that can complete auditing, writing statements, advice on making systems more accessible, or as you've mentioned, like estates experts, things like that, it can save for organizations quite a lot of money in the long run. If I was going to make the case that this is a financially sound decision, you're not paying external consultants for this. You're not having to deliver retroactive costly fixes that might go against contract. You'll have less complaints, less Equality Act challenges, less staff time, less wasted student time in dealing with all of these struggles. among a wide variety of positives as well, several other additional benefits to making accessibility intrinsic to what we're doing. So for me, making sure we're properly resourcing staff is not only a good decision, it really is a fundamental decision for me that I think we all should be taking. So that's me. That's me done. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you, George, for kicking us off with that. Next, Dr. Suanne Gibson is Associate Professor of Inclusive Education at Plymouth Institute of Education, who is an established academic in the field with interest in critical disability studies, social justice and inclusion within higher education, and student partnership. A frequent conference and keynote speaker in this field, her recent work also includes working with Damnation and Positively Autistic to launch Damnation UK, a summer school for young people with autism, which will run this August.
Thank you, Amelia. Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. It's wonderful to be here. Yeah, so as Amelia has said, my name is Suanne Gibson, and I'm an Associate Professor of Inclusive Education at Plymouth Institute of Education here at Plymouth University. And I have a significant, I suppose, history in the field of social justice and education, and also the question of rights in relation to minority groups in society. And obviously that comes into the field then around the question of disability as well. So the first thing I really wanted to say was just a huge congratulations to Met and her team, to the Disabled Students UK. I think that this report, and I'm sure that everyone that's here in this space will agree with me, I think this report is quite a significant achievement. And having researched in this field for a long time, I believe that this work is actually seminal and a potential game changer in its evidence-based review of UK HE inclusive provision. So I'm really looking forward to speaking for just a few minutes in terms of lessons 3 and 6, and then opening up for wider discussion. And I hope that whatever emerges from this space today, people will be bringing back some of the key messages, some of the key poignant examples of effective practice back into those spaces, and really promoting change, so that that change becomes an established normal part of our daily practices in teaching and higher education, not just something that we did during a pandemic, because I think we've learned so much and we want to continue with that really across the sector. So if I may, I have one slide to share. I'm going to try and keep it to the 5 minutes, but I might be a little bit over, but I have one slide to share. So I'm just, can you see that? What do you see at the minute? Is that the right one? Okay, okay, good, because my desktop screensaver is my cat. And I really don't want you to see that. Okay, so excellent. So good. We're on my PowerPoint slide. Excellent. Okay. Okay. So lesson 3, the compassionate approach. I think trying to do justice with just 5 minutes to this report, and there's so much to unpack. So I've extracted what for me are the most poignant messages in the report, addressing lessons 3, attitudes and compassion, and also lesson 6, listening to disabled students. I've also based those messages on the 2 themes as noted in the report, one of equity and one of hope. And again, I have to say, I think a fantastic job really was done on that report, having gathered so much data, having done so much analysis, and then trying to consider the most effective way to present that in a manageable and palatable way that people can take it forward. But I really appreciated, I thought, those 2 themes, one of equity and one of hope, within each of your lessons, because it gave us something to consider in terms of what's not right, what needs to change, and then also the message of hope. So with lesson 3, I think what I'm hearing here, and I think this was something, Meta, you mentioned earlier, in terms of a citation from one of the students who responded to your questionnaire, practices during the pandemic that were previously rejected out of hand as vague references to pedagogy have started to be seen as valid and sometimes superior options. And then the theme of hope, flexibility and compassion can improve accessibility without lowering standards. Having studied the report and having been a part of the earlier launch when things were just coming together with the work that had been shared on your data analysis. I think what I'm hearing in this report, in the final report as well, are the voices that I've heard for many years in my work, and the conversations that I've held with my students as partners in my teaching and learning practice in my research. And those lessons, those insights are to do with ableism and ableist barriers, both tangible and otherwise, those that present as barricades to their successful learning and progression. I think if one positions oneself as an inclusive educator and/or believes in the power and purpose of critical pedagogy, then one must surely notice, as John Mason would put it, when ableism arises in our teaching spaces. The question then arises, or the question then comes, how do we act? How do we make change and equity happen in real and sustained ways? And I think it's about listening to these lessons that are coming from this report and taking them really on board in a serious and significant way into policy and practice is one of the ways in which we can maintain that change in a real and sustained way. Now, the next thing I'm going to mention goes back to one of the delegates, and I think it was Sue, apologies if I've got your name wrong. You mentioned about the importance of compassion. I have developed and published on this position of compassion, but I talk about it being politicized compassion. As you probably gathered from my accent, I come from quite a political part of the world in terms of Northern Ireland. And I think it's important that when it comes to this issue of disability rights and equity and moving forward, that we remember that there is an awful lot of politics wrapped up in this. Politics by which I mean who has power, who hasn't got power, who has agency, who has voice. So for me, the political is always, I think, a prominent factor in any of these issues and questions that we discuss around social justice. And therefore, it very much comes into this this framework, this format, this space here today as well. So I've written about this idea, this theory of politicized compassion, and the importance of fostering that in higher education through pedagogical partnership between students and tutors. What is pedagogical partnership? It's about working in a collaborative space with students, using critical pedagogy to promote collaboration and empower student voice. Political pedagogy, or pedagogical partnership rather, enables sustained student agency, success, and the creation of active, considerate citizens. A colleague by the name of Mann in 2001 proposes that pedagogical partnerships are a counter response to alienation, providing solidarity, redistribution of power and criticality, as well as compassion. So pedagogical partnerships for me, and in terms of my practice and in my research, and with many other colleagues who I know utilise this in their spaces, support students and academics and other staff if we're working in collaboration. It supports us in embracing the transformational potential of collaborative work. And for those of you who are interested in looking into this further, I would recommend some of the publications of Alison Cook-Sather, Mike or Ruth Healy, and I'm happy to share further references for anyone who wants to connect at a later stage. Meta, I'm sure we can pass that through on whatever other forums we've got. Thank you. Okay. So I think where we have effective partnership and collaboration, I think if we're listening and if we're engaging with that and the kinds of outputs that are coming out of this report, what can emerge are significant practical changes that can bring about individual and wider transformation. With lesson 6, apologies, 1 second. With lesson 6, what I hear are muffled voices. Student experiences and oppression, not being heard or understood, perhaps being responded to in the tick box way. What I also hear is the failure of the rights discourse. And I think that's an important point just to bring into this space, because we have had the Disability Discrimination Act, we have had SENDA, we have had various other significant policies and equality legislations. And yet we are still today in a situation where a significant number of our students are not being listened to, are not being empowered. And because of the situations they find themselves in within our spaces, are choosing to leave higher education. So what are we doing wrong? If we have these legislations in place, how come we're not rolling out those policies to implement effective equality? So what I would suggest is that the actual delivery or rollout in terms of practical policies and in their evaluation, and this is a key point, it has failed to engage with the very community it purports to liberate. This community, the disabled students, more than a fifth of our current students have experienced various forms of exclusion and othering. And some of this may not just be related to their disability, but to other intersections which we do need to consider as well. For example, gender, sexuality, race, age. There is much here to consider. And so disabled students offer a collective insight. And if we look here at the theme of inequity, start with having conversations. Of course, conversations, connect, collaborate, discuss, listen to us, understand what we really need. And where that happens, the theme of hope arises. And then students who have been proactively consulted may find that the challenges that are being presented to them can be addressed and we can move forward. And so for me, our disabled students, they offer a collective insight into their lived and observed experiences with inequality. Their knowledge provides richly layered and nuanced insights into structural and cultural barriers to inclusion. When given a platform and valued by the Academy, which is what I think we have today with this piece of writing, this piece of work, and its publication today in the Independent, which is wonderful. This knowledge provides layered, nuanced insights. When given a platform, this can deliver material which can be used to challenge injustice and to push forward change. So we need to partner up. We need to collaborate. We need to listen. For me, the key takeaway for higher education leaders and practitioners, and to all of us in this space, the key takeaway is that of student partnership, that of student empowerment of voice, and also compassion. And I don't believe that we can, as a sector, move forward successfully in terms of our disabled students' progression and our degree programme attractiveness and effectiveness. So this impacts in lots of other ways as well. We cannot move forward if we do not hear or respond meaningfully to those key messages. So thank you very much, Meta, and to your wider team as well.
Thank you for that so much. If you don't mind, Suanne, I'm just going to stop the participant sharing if that's okay with you. Cool. Next, Professor Becky Huxley-Binns has a background in law and is the current Pro-Vice-Chancellor of Education at Hull University. Her responsibilities encompass a wide academic strategic portfolio, which unfortunately I couldn't completely summarise in this, so apologies to you, Becky. But alongside this work, she has membership of the Advanced HE Teaching and Learning Strategic Advisory Group, and we welcome her to speak now.
Thank you very much indeed, Amelia. I'll start with my sensory description. I am a white woman with blonde hair, and in my early 50s. I'm not prepared to admit whereabouts. I am female. I use she, her pronouns. I'm wearing red glasses and a black top. And as Amelia said, I'm the Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Education at the University of Hull. And in essence, I have strategic oversight of all courses, all of our taught portfolio, our assessments and the student experience. And I'd like to speak to lesson 5. I want to echo Suanne's congratulations to DS UK for publication of this. And forgive me if some of the observations I'm going to make are unstructured. That's because I wrote a series of notes as I read the report, and as things popped into my head, I made a note on them. So as a university leader, what can we do to rise to the challenges in this report? Well, I've already commissioned an investigation into reasonable adjustments at the University of Hull. That's a team consisting of student support services, our Students' Union and the Teaching Excellence Academy, because I am sure that we can design out reasonable adjustments by using more inclusive assessments in the first place. And back in the day when I was a law teacher, nobody ever challenged me on my choice of assessment methods. I would submit my assessment and said, that's what I'm doing. And no one said, are you sure? Have you thought of an alternative? Is there another way to do this? And I know that if somebody had challenged me, I would have thought about it. And I would have participated in a conversation about it. So the second lesson is to make sure you university leaders build up a strong team of learning advisors, learning development advisors, who will gently, constructively challenge the choice of assessment methods. I was told many years ago, if you get assessment right, everything else follows. And the older I get, the more I think the person who told me that was onto something. The next thing I would do and have done at the University of Hull is I've abolished learning outcomes and we've moved to a competence-based higher education framework. And this is as a result in 2017 of reading the OIA Good Practice Framework supporting disabled students. And it was the most mind-expanding report that I'd ever read about how to approach assessment pedagogy to be inclusive. And the core of it was about competences. So it took me a few years to get to the University of Hull, and we abolished learning outcomes. And I said, it's about competences because it's about the person. And it's always about the person. And the challenge you have as a leader is you put in place these rules that apply to everybody, but students don't live as everybody, they live as individuals, as we all do. We all live as individuals. So we need to understand the impact of whole institution policies on individuals. If you don't mind, I will put in the chat. We've moved to have an inclusive education framework at the University of Hull. It is an holistic approach. It's a whole institution. It covers our structures, processes, curriculum, assessment, feedback, how we can nurture a sense of community and belonging, and how we can secure pathways to success for all students. And it is inclusive. And what I'd like to do is move to a position where everyone benefits, and then where we need to make individual adjustments, but they should be far, far fewer than we see across the higher education sector globally, far, far fewer. A proper leadership whinge now, you've got to make sure your data are clean and reliable and accurate. And once you've got clean, reliable, accurate data, you've got to use those data to gain insight. It's one thing to be told that your disability awarding gap is increasing or decreasing, but you need the insight from that to understand what interventions have been put in place and which are the most effective and why. And then, to echo everything Suanne just said, you make decisions in partnership with students. So you never stop asking, you never stop responding, you never stop listening. So one example that I am going to say, in some ways, from a higher education perspective only, very limited. The pandemic was fortuitous because I was able to drive through change that had been resisted, including lecture recording, digital assessments, and just one comment I've seen in the chat about captioning. It seems to be a huge challenge in HE. Vicky Chin, I agree with you. I've had a lot of feedback from very eager staff who have to go through captioning after their lectures to clean them up, because in certain disciplines, what the captioning hears and what we want our students to see are very, very different. Examples come from law, from biomed, but particularly from the School of Anatomy. And I shall leave it there and leave it to your imagination of what closed captioning sometimes does in those areas. Thank you very much for inviting me to be here.
Thank you so much for that, Becky, and please do post whatever resources you can to the chat. That's something we would highly recommend. Lastly, but by no means leastly at all, we have Jim Dickinson, who has extensive experience within the NUS and student unions more widely, and who is an associate editor at Wonkhe, taking particular interest in the student experience, university governance and regulation. And with that, I warmly welcome Jim to the conversation.
Thank you, Amelia. Great to be here. Actually, it's not in many ways great to be here. And I say that because we read a lot of things at Wonkhe. We read a lot of reports. Lots of people send us things. And lots of them I'm kind of numb to. I'll read them on a train and try to find the interesting bit in there, but often we'll find it hard to work up any enthusiasm about some of the things that we get sent that I have to summarize for wonkhe.com. But now and again, I get sent stuff that makes me quite angry. And frequently the things that make me quite angry, and this has applied right throughout all of the time I've been involved in higher education, frequently those things concern disabled students. And there were many aspects of this report that just made me angry, and hopefully I'll be able to kind of explain that anger over the course of the next few minutes. Before I get into this, the sensory description: I am white, in my late 40s, I have very short hair, I'm wearing glasses, I identify as male, I use he, him pronouns. The central thrust, I guess, of the report, this idea that what being forced online has done is make higher education more accessible, of course, is the right one. There's absolutely no doubt that online learning has in many ways accelerated conversations about things that have made higher education more accessible. I'm not necessarily convinced that the pandemic has accelerated conversations about accessibility. And I'm not necessarily convinced that the pandemic has has intensified conversations about accessibility. And one thing that I would say to those people that are kind of around the sector that are on the call today is that there is a danger, I think, that the report in many ways really highlights and illustrates in assuming that because something has become more accessible, that therefore people are thinking more clearly or more deeply about accessibility, because I'm not sure that's the case. And in fact, for me, what the report does is illustrate really clearly just how little work has been done to take advantage of the kind of accidental accessibility that the pandemic has generated to ensure that people are thinking more urgently and more deeply about accessibility. And there's lots of ways in which I think the report does that. One thing, certainly, that I fed back a couple of weeks ago when I saw the draft, and that I would urge people to kind of try to think about really clearly, is it is true that lots of disabled students have found their education to be more accessible as a result of some of the things that have happened during the pandemic. But there is a fine line between delivering some features of higher education that make it more accessible and using online as a way to make campuses more accessible rather than making campuses more accessible. In other words, we don't make higher education campuses more accessible by telling people to stay away from them. And we should be careful, I think, about that. There are some aspects of this that I think are very interesting from a funding and regulatory point of view. For example, our home student funding rules in the UK don't allow us to issue maintenance loans for distance learning students. And there are lots of impacts of that policy that I think make this conversation even more difficult than it ought to be. There's no doubt that it's possible for universities to offer distance learning for students who find the campus inaccessible, but the tolerance level of what we mean by completely inaccessible, I'm not sure is clear in the minds of lots of academics and senior managers. And perhaps much more importantly, if we have a regulatory system that prevents us from offering fully funded distance learning options for home undergraduates that aren't disabled, that's going to make a conversation about offering it for disabled students much more difficult than it really needs to be. And so some of those conversations about distance learning and student funding policies, I think, are important in this context. But most of all, my biggest reflection about the report really is about the anticipatory principle, which is where we started, I think, this afternoon on the panel. I think what's really interesting about it is there are many people in higher education that have as much as admitted that during the early stages of the pandemic, they were kind of surprised to learn that many of the things that happened generated accessibility, and that now there's been a lot of swing back on that pendulum. Lots of people are also surprised to have learned, thanks to complaint and reports like this and discussions with students, that there's been a swing back on accessibility. And the initial surprise, the positive surprise, and the surprise now, the negative surprise, I think those two things are just as bad as each other, because what they both illustrate is a failure to embed properly the anticipatory principle. And I'd just say a few things about that in the context of the report. The first is, during the summer of 2020, one of the things that I picked up when I was supporting student unions that were having conversations about what were due to be in August, September and October of 2020, restricted but not closed campuses, was that it wasn't so much that disabled students weren't factored into that conversation, it's that students and their lives weren't really factored into that conversation at all. And so, for example, when people were thinking about the various aspects of delivery that could be delivered, if you like, in September 2020, too few people were thinking about the lives of students and what it would be like to be a student throughout the course of that year. And then the inevitable happened, because no one had remembered that it is important for students not to feel isolated. Lots of people suddenly started to feel very isolated, and that started to manifest itself in all sorts of discussions. So part of this, I think, isn't just about anticipating the needs of disabled students. It is about thinking about delivery of higher education and the links between different aspects of higher education from a student perspective rather than a delivery perspective. And I think that's sometimes difficult. Related to that is that one of the things it's clear that we learned in the early parts of the pandemic is that the support that students offer each other is incredibly important. There were some people, often on social media, that I ended up in a row with, that regarded students complaining about social isolation as whining and whinging, as if the social experience of learning is somehow a luxury bonus, that what the pandemic had taken away was them being able to socialize with their friends. And as far as they were concerned, the higher education was still happening. But I think for most people, not those people that I talk about, for most people, what is clear is that what the pandemic did was rob people of the opportunity to build the networks that we know sustain them in education. And so from a disabled student point of view, not only has it always been the case that the ability to build those networks has always been significantly more restricted, the idea that we will kind of swing back and just bank all of the accessibility gains from an online perspective does worry me, partly because if our answer to making higher education more accessible is to cut people off from the kind of social networking opportunities that students have, that would be a real shame. And so whilst it's really important to make sure that we bank all of the important progress on accessibility, it's also important, I think, that we redouble our efforts to make sure that disabled students are able to access each other and other students, as well as just the kind of course and the material. But I want to say something really clear about the anticipatory principle. I have been watching these kinds of reports come out for a very long time, and I have to say this is one of the best I've read, but I have been reading reports like this come out for a long time, and I've met lots of disabled students, officers and reps involved in student unions over the 25 years I've been involved. We have a culture in higher education which is about taking something that we generally believe to be fine and having meetings and encounters and reports which try to make it a little bit better, a kind of enhancement culture. And I think a lot of the time that works. It allows there to be collaboration and partnership and for people to use their voice to try and make things better. But on these issues, on so many of these issues, particularly around the anticipatory principle, I think higher education needs to approach the problem from a slightly different perspective. it is fine to take something that is generally good and when there is time and when there is voice to work to improve it. But what we're not doing enough of on these, what are in the end legal duties, which are in the end the process by which we make the thing actually accessible for actual people. We have to have an audit and fix culture. So let me explain what I think that means. It is, of course, a great idea to make sure that academics on the ground are trained in many of these issues around, making education more accessible. But my question to universities is, have you audited whether any anticipatory work has actually been done? So if I said tomorrow, do we know how many course leaders, when reviewing their curriculum and their delivery this year, have thought about the needs of disabled students during the process of doing that review? We ought to know the number. In other words, we ought to be auditing and checking whether the anticipatory work has been done, not whether there's any complaints or whether it feeds through to outcomes, because these are legal minimums. And so what that means is that potentially we need to change the way we address some of the recommendations in the report inside the culture of universities and their decision-making structures. Similarly, I think it's incredibly important that disabled students have a voice on campus and are able to elect representatives and so on. But the idea that that's a substitute for auditing what is basically a set of legal minimums, I think is problematic. We can't depend on there being a passionate disabled student that has the time to advocate for others to make sure that accessibility is delivered. We need other ways of making sure that that happens. We wouldn't depend on people making complaints or electing other people to fix various other minimums on campus. And we should move, therefore, many of these issues into that kind of audit, checking and assurance box. Part of that, I think, is being much clearer to disabled students about their rights. Part of that, I think, is the Office for Students not depending principally on outcomes data to work out whether this is working, but instead moving to a situation where we properly regulate the outputs, which isn't very fashionable these days, but I think is really important. And part of it, as I say, is making sure that we have systems around audit. One other thing, though, that I just wanted to raise while I've got the floor. In many ways, one of the things that I think the report highlights is the impacts of isolation and uncertainty during the pandemic. And one of the things that I think is very interesting about the latest mental health stats that have been coming from the ONS, the Office for National Statistics, is they are repeatedly showing us that levels of student anxiety in particular are really, really, really high and are persistently high out of the back of the pandemic. And I think what I would say about that is there are ways to deliver teaching and learning experiences that alleviate and mitigate against some of the harshest impacts of anxiety. There are ways, in other words, to reduce isolation and reduce uncertainty when delivering teaching, learning and assessment. And too few academics, in my view and in my experience, understand some of the mental health implications of the way they deliver teaching and learning. And we ought to get to a point where more academics understand and are able to anticipate that some of the ways in which they deliver teaching and learning might be exacerbating a mental health crisis. But for the purposes of this audience, I just want to say this. If it is the case that the vast majority of the student body right now have rocketing and very high levels of anxiety, for me, what that tells us is that right now, the vast majority of students in this country are disabled and there are legal duties. This isn't a nice to have. This isn't if we have time, a few academics ought to understand mental health. There are legal duties around making sure that disabled students are able to access their education. And so if the anxiety levels amongst students are as high as they are right now, we should regard making sure that we treat teaching and learning in the next 18 months as something that ought to be thought through from the perspective of anxiety and mental health as a legal responsibility rather than a luxury. Thank you.
Well, Jim, I want to thank you for that. And I'm not quite sure how we're going to follow on from that in the Q&A, but thank you to all of our panelists, because I think that the whole kind of piece of that has been really interesting. But I am going to attempt to start a Q&A off the back of that. So please do bear with.
Yeah, just a note that it's time for another break very soon. Shall we
yes.
do that before the...
Yes, in fact, if we do that now for the access break of 5 minutes, then come back at past. Does that work?
So it's 5 minutes.
The Zoom will stay open, so if you want to submit any more questions, please do. Hi all, just a notification that we're going to start up again. So warning to our panelists to ready themselves for questions. I will start. We have a few questions. Please note that we only have about half an hour, so if panelists keep to a few minutes, that would be great, and then we could get through as many as possible. So the first question is from our audience. The HE sector as a whole seems to be taking the approach to accessibility, especially the public sector accessibility regulations, that it's cheaper to do nothing and wait for a legal case rather than be proactive. How can this attitude be changed? If people would like to put up their hands as panelists, and I can pick who wants first, if that's okay with people.
So could I ask just to have that repeated, please?
Yeah, of course.
Thank
sorry
you.
about that. So the HE sector as a whole seems to be taking the approach to accessibility, especially the public sector accessibility regulations, that it's cheaper to do nothing, sorry, my phone's just gone off, and wait for a legal case rather than be proactive. How can this attitude be changed? And George, you have your hand up, sorry.
Oh, sorry, George, go ahead.
George, you go first, and then I'll come to you, Suanne, afterwards, if that's okay.
Brilliant, thank you. Sorry, it is kind of true in many cases, and it does really bother me. I worry that people that take that approach also drive around without any insurance, on the idea that it's cheaper to buy a new car when they have an accident rather than, prepare for this in advance. It's a really stupid attitude, to be honest. Like, I'm not going to pull my punches here with this one, I think, because we're 4 years into these regulations. Fine, it might be cheaper to deal with an Equality Act challenge for one particular system and do nothing for several years. Maybe that is the case for you. But we have to consider it's not just how do they settle that court case, it's all of the additional damage that comes from that, the reputational damage that comes from being known as a poor university that doesn't deal with their students effectively. It pushes students away. Not just that, but once you've had one complaint and they know that people can get money out of you because they don't particularly care and that attitudes come out, there's nothing to stop people digging in and saying, oh, that was one system. What about this next system? What about this other system? Universities have hundreds of systems that people could complain about for a variety of reasons. And I think it's a very unwise attitude to take, to say, we'll take the loss on one because it will only ever be that one thing. And once we've had that issue, it'll be another 10 years before we get something else. I don't see it that way. I see it as once people know and have got the righteous anger there to challenge you on this and have found out that you really aren't taking this seriously, it's going to be a hell of a lot easier for people to come after you a second, a third, a fourth time when you've just shown your hand that you've not taken any steps towards this. And I don't think for most universities that is the case. I've definitely seen everyone taking some level of approach to this. The universities as a sector are more compliant than a lot of other areas that I've looked into in my own research. But I think some people out there do have minds that need to be changed in this, and it's going to be a struggle that a lot of staff need to have to convince everyone that this is a thing that we need to do. Sorry, ramble over. There we go.
That's all right, George. Suanne, if you want to come in next.
Yeah, I mean, I take on board what George is saying, and but I would be of the view that what we have now in terms of this particular document, this particular report, is a way where we can push forward to ensure that universities become more responsive, responsible, and proactive in terms of their delivery, being more widely accessible to all of our students. And I would be saying to all the students that are gathered here today, I mean, there's nothing better than the power of numbers. And I think that this is an opportunity today and for the next while to really promote this report, to bring it to the powers that be, to place it on the desks of vice-chancellors, of senior leaders within ICT delivery, library development, or whatever it might be, our student services, so that they become familiar. And I think the way into an awful lot of these spaces, I think it's always important to acknowledge the good and the positive that people are doing in the sector. And we know that there is an awful lot of that across the HE sector in terms of progressive, accessible provision for students. So I think it's, for me, it's always better to come into the conversation acknowledging the positive that's being done in a university or in a situation or an institution, and then talk about, well, what else can we do? Not just what else can we do, not just what else can we do, but what more should we be doing when we think about anticipatory duties or SENDA or other such equality legislations. And I think this particular report needs to get onto the desk of every single senior leader across the HE sector sooner rather than later, so that we can have those wider discussions and really, again, as I've said earlier, making sure that our disabled students are a key part of that conversation space and taking that forward, because there's nothing worse than having the delivery of policy and evaluation done by people who don't really know what the lived experience is of being a disabled student in higher education. So for me, it's about promoting this work, raising and encouraging more conversation and dialogue about it, but also acknowledging where the university, where the HE sector is doing well, and then working towards a more progressive future development. That would be my suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Suanne. I'm going to take a bit of a liberty here and actually start answering this question myself. Jim, I will come to you, but I think we might have some crossover on this answer to this question. I think on what you've just said, Suanne, and what I think is being implied is that often you need disabled students in the room while you're having these conversations in general. And I will bring up the fact that I believe it's Cambridge's SU is the only SU in the country with a paid full-time disabled students officer. The general representation for disabled students, if there is any, is a part-time volunteer student. Suanne, you want to come in?
Sorry, we have a disabled student representing within Plymouth University SU as well, or we have.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I think this the point I'm making is the kind of the pay scale and the employment kind of gap within this. If it's very difficult for disabled students officers who are already studying at the same time and doing this kind of representation work to then continue doing that with their own health. And so it's really important that universities give the funding within their block grants, presumably, to pay for not only kind of a paid position within student representation, but also that comes with kind of staff support to do this work. Because as everyone in this kind of virtual room is aware, there is a lot of work to be done. And so to put that onto a kind of part-time student for all intents and purposes is not the best kind of structure we could advocate for. And we know from Cambridge that that is a full-time job because they do actually employ someone full-time to do that. So I think there is that. And with my kind of advocacy for paid work for disabled students, I will pass on to Jim.
Look, I agree with all of that, but I mean, let me just come at this from a slightly different angle. There is universities are led by academics, and there's a UK professional standards framework for academics that doesn't mention accessibility as a kind of core competence of being a good university teacher. That's a scandal. My next question would be, is it possible to get to a point where you can join a university and start teaching and not having been trained in some of these things? Yes, it is. Is it possible for you to end up being in a position where you run a module and it's possible for you not to understand some of these concepts? Yes, it is. And I can carry on, and I can probably identify the odd head of department, dean of a faculty, pro-vice-chancellor even, and perhaps in some cases vice-chancellor, just to let you off, Becky, that hasn't been exposed to and understands these concepts. If we're interested in something that should be universally applied, we have to take steps to make sure it's universally applied. And what I'd say about that is, you know, the reality about academic governance in most universities is it's still operating on a feudal craft system where we look back on some of the things that have happened and take into account feedback and complaints. It depends on feedback and complaints. And I guess what I'd say is, with the activism energy that we have, we should try to stop it depending on feedback and complaints and cause there to be a sensible conversation, sometimes with academics, sometimes with staff trade unions, about the things that we must do and the things that we will do if there is time, if there is an opportunity to have a discussion and so on. Because that set of musts is really, really important from lots of angles, but definitely from this angle.
Thank you, Gemma. With that great opening, I will hand over to Becky, who also has her hand up.
Becky, you're muted.
It's because I'm brand new to online meetings. Honestly, 2 years and I've learned nothing. I've also been reading Harriet Cannon's comments in the Q&A. So let's deal with I've got quite a lot, try and make some order of it. This document, I would suggest, is the carrot, not the stick. I think it's the way to get people in who perhaps haven't got this lived experience, and either haven't got the time or the emotional intelligence to understand how important this is. Jim, I'm on the Learning and Teaching Strategic Advisory Group for Advanced HE. We're discussing the PSF tomorrow. I will make the very strong point about accessibility and inclusivity needs to be in the professional standards framework. I'll also do a shout out to my colleagues at the University of Hull who run our PCAP, our PGCE, the course that new academics need to take, because inclusive education is right at the core of all of that, because I've never stopped going on about it. But actually, I want to give you some concrete advice. University governances, they have boards of governors, they have council, they have senate, they have antiquated, wonderful structures that and the way things are done because they've always been done. But they also usually have some form of audit and risk committee, and they oversee the risk register, and legal breaches should be on the risk. So do a bit of Googling, find out who your chair of the Board of Governors is, find out who your chair of council is, find out who chairs the Risk and Audit Committee, drop a line under the Equality Act to explain the public sector equality duty, public sector equality obligations, and add that it is put on the risk register. And if it isn't put on the risk register, why not? And then follow it up with the freedom of information. Can we make sure that everything I've said there is put under Chatham House rules? But that's how you do it. The obligation under the law is also your tool to make sure that those obligations are seen through. So you are empowered to raise this with the people who've got the power to say, yeah, we're putting that in the risk register. That is a high risk, it's reputational, it's legal, it's financial. It's also the right bloody thing to do. So get it on the risk register if you're not getting traction elsewhere.
Awesome. I don't think we could have said that better ourselves, Becky. So thank you for that last sentence and a half. Let me just look at the questions we have received. George, this might be one for you specifically, as a question has been put through. George, you talk about there being a culture of caring about this at Westminster. How did this happen, and is there anything other institutions can learn from that?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one for me, because I have recently joined Westminster. I joined at the beginning of January. Previous to that, as was mentioned in my intro, I've been working in government, and the culture was already there. It was an interesting thing to come into this place, and for the last 2 years, several committed members of staff that really cared about this topic had pushed it as I've seen with several others, they fought for this to be on the agenda. And what was great is that Westminster took this seriously. They started up a formalized project. They had objectives. They had things they wanted to achieve to align with the regulations. It was on the risk register, which I cannot agree with enough. And so I arrived recently, and already lots of those foundational pieces of work had been done, which I think are really important, and you know, should be planned out. So there has been several pieces of staff training offered, both for academic staff and professional staff. There has been some level of student engagement. There has been changes to the procurement processes to make sure we're starting to buy in more accessible platforms. There have been awareness raising exercises, a recently set up colleague disability network to start making sure we're supporting staff as well as students. And as I kind of said in my comments about a couple of the lessons, a lot of this has come off goodwill, admittedly then supported with this project that gave people some time to focus on this as their day job, gave people time to upskill themselves, share their learning with their colleagues, get this out across the organization. And if there's something I can recommend to others, again, it does kind of come back to all of what's been said over the last nearly couple of hours now. It's about resourcing those staff to go out and do that. It's about getting this awareness raising. It's about, as others have said, using this carrot. And I think, again, this paper is a definite carrot rather than a stick, even though my personal approach is normally more stick than carrot, to convince people over to our side, convert them to the cult of delivering accessibility. It's going to be a long fight, I reckon, but I think we are going to get there. And again, it's just going to be continued awareness raising, sustainable support for the long run, not a one and done, not to ignore it until we get a challenge. It's just going to be one of those things that we have to, as a group, collectively, every conversation we have with anyone, have you thought about the accessibility of this? Just always get it into every conversation.
Thank you for that, George. And in the interest of time, I'm going to move swiftly on to the next question. Meta, if you also want to put the feedback form in the chat, just because I'm aware we've got about 10 minutes left while we answer this question. So let me see. Why do you think disabled students have been forgotten historically and during the pandemic? What structures need to be in place to change this going forward? Suanne? Yeah.
I'm just going to jump in and I think, forgive me if I've misunderstood that question, but it's to do with sort of the historic exclusion of the disabled community from access to society, access to effective education, access to progression in terms of life and life opportunities. And I think that it very much connects to the critical field around education and the critique around the division of education, historically special education and mainstream education. And we can go right back to the Victorian times and before then, when we know that disability was something that was traditionally perceived as very negative, as something to be treated, as something that could ideally become normalized through the treatment of a medication or operations or whatever it may have been. But if not, then the provision was very much about segregation. Institutionalization, as we know, was a horrendous provision back in the day. But there is historically a very separate form of provision in education. And I think that has led itself to develop this historical pejorative position when it comes to viewing disability, which thank God, has something that we have really challenged and moved forward on since the 1970s, 80s. And I would really want to call out the disability rights movement and many of our colleagues in relation to that in the 70s and 80s in terms of pushing things forward and moving towards a more appropriate, more equitable, inclusive form of education. But I think what our delegate colleague is asking that question is, the issue is to do with that deep history of segregation, that deep history of separation, and also that history of what was valued and what was not valued, and the pejorativeness that was aligned to disability. So I think that things have moved on an awful lot, but there are still those issues, they still arise. And I think for those of you who will be familiar with the field of inclusive education, I think we've seen a lot of regression over the last few years, and our provision in terms of special educational needs in this country is shocking in many ways. Where I felt in my idealist pro-Labour Tony Blair back in the day in the 1990s, I was very much of the belief that we are going to live in a fully inclusive society with a fully inclusive education system where all pupils, all people can be educated together regardless of any particular disability or special education needs. It doesn't matter who or what you are, we are together to be educated together, because that's the nature of the world. We are diverse. So why is it not being represented in our education system? So I think we've kind of come through various waves with that, and I think that over the last 10, 15, 20 years or so, there's been a little bit of regression in terms of prioritizing that evolution in our mainstream education system. So I think trying to summarize in a nutshell a response to that question, it's historic, and we still need to push for change, but it's very much an historic, I think, issue. We need to understand that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, that's Suanne. I'm going to move for Jim to answer next, but ask in the kindest possible terms if you could do it swiftly, because we've got one more question to get to, if that would be okay.
I mean, I've kind of answered this in previous questions, but I just want to say two very quick things. The very first year I was involved in students' unions, on my desk was a mountain and hill walking accident. And what that caused us to do is to stop regarding health and safety in student activities as something that the kind of champions and those who are interested would be interested in, and move to a point where no one was allowed to go on a trip unless they'd undergone the training. And I do think we need to kind of go there, notwithstanding the fact that we need hearts and minds. If we haven't got their hearts, they shouldn't be allowed to do the teaching, I think is the point, notwithstanding the fact that we need to do it. And the other thing I'd say quickly is, there's a technology adoption curve that lots of people use when they're thinking about new technology, the illustration of which I've put in the chat. Too much of our well-meaning conversation is about what we do on the left-hand side of that curve. What I'm really interested in is what we do on the right-hand side of the curve, and what senior leaders in universities do on the right-hand side of that curve to make sure that to some extent, the right-hand side of the curve is accelerated or even eradicated. That's the really killer question I think lots of people need to be asking.
Thank you for that, Jim, and thank you for somehow getting resources in there and under 2 minutes. So I congratulate you for that. Let me just get to this question. What role do you see for disabled students in the process of making courses more accessible and inclusive to ensure the right needs are anticipated and principles like nothing about us without us doesn't require a lot of unpaid activist labour from disabled students? And Meta's already got her hand up, so I'm going to go to you first, love.
Thank you. So I think it's worth talking a little bit about, I'm actually giving a talk about how can you work with your disabled students later this week. So we've got a few ideas on this topic. First of all, I think listening to disabled students officers, right? So listening to the disabled student activist who comes to you is very important. But it's not enough. So where we're currently at is there can be an antagonistic relationship, right, between disabled student activists within the university and the people that they are trying to kind of talk to and show what the problems are. This is made worse by the fact that often complaints processes aren't brought up when it comes to accessibility, or they aren't made accessible, so there's not like accommodations associated with complaints processes often, which just makes it very difficult for disabled students to raise these issues. I really appreciate the comments made about how to bring it to the attention of people who are supposed to be looking at risk. So that's a great way forward. We have within DSUK, we offer individual students come to us who are experiencing issues, and it's going through a process of trying to bring these things to the attention of staff is harrowing in many cases. It's emotionally difficult, and it takes we have loads of cases where it's taken years to go through the process and get the support that you need. So it's not something that we ever ask disabled students to do, just because it really needs to be a personal choice. I think one way of making sure that you are listening to the disabled student voice is going. I'll talk about going broad and going deep. You do need to work with individual disabled students, right? So you need to find those individual students who are engaged, who have that drive, who have areas where they can, I don't know if it's community building or report writing, but areas where they can work with you to improve the situation for disabled students. And you need to think about what their strengths are and go with that as well. And then going wide, you have to make sure that you're actually listening to a wider range of disabled students' experiences. So you can't depend on that one person. Oh, and by the way, you do have to pay that one person. So one thing that we're doing at this point is we're making sure that we're charging for all our kind of consulting work. And you're very welcome to come to us, but also you probably have someone at your university, a disabled student. I shouldn't say most. A lot of universities have a disabled student officers. So you probably have a small group of people who are engaged and wanting to make a difference already at your university. But you do need to compensate them for the work, because disabled student officers burn out before the end of term more often than not, right? It's an incredibly difficult job if you don't have it as your full-time job, which, as Leah said, only Cambridge does. But on the topic of going wide, the Access Insight project is aimed at trying to measure the experiences of disabled students, right? So that you get a good idea of which part of the university is accessible and which parts are not. And you get a good idea of which departments are accessible, and is the digital accessibility working, is student accommodation working. There are so many different parts to accessibility, which you can only really get by going straight to the source of like who's having this experience. So yeah, I guess those would be my thoughts about making sure that we're working with disabled students in a way that doesn't lead to burnout and doesn't make it even more difficult for the student in question.
Yeah, and I would say this is one of our kind of specialist areas as well. So if you do want to continue this conversation, please do let us know via our contact channels. We do have 2 minutes if anybody else wants to come in this topic and maybe take 30 seconds. I am sorry, we have like a minute left, but I'm trying to get as much information out of this session as possible. Do let me know if anybody else wants to speak. Jim, if you can keep it to 30 seconds, I would love you forever.
Very quickly, certainly in England right now, there's a big conversation about outcomes generated by regulation. Now, if it was up to me, there'd be more of a focus on outputs when it comes to disabled students, but we are where we are. I think lots of people are going to be having conversations about what it is that leads to poor outcomes in the next year or so. And I think, you know, where people are starting to have the conversation about attainment gaps and poor outcomes for disabled students, that is the anchor to then talking about the experiences that lead to those poor outcomes. I don't like the regulation we have, but never pass up the opportunity to centre some of the concerns that have been expressed on this webinar inside the regulatory pressures, because every governing body, every Senate, every academic board, every university council will on one level or another, at least in England, be thinking about those outcomes very hard over the next 18 months.
Thank you, Jen. That was perfect timing. We are dead on 3 o'clock and we do need to end this session. Please do take a copy of our feedback form for any feedback you have on this session, or if you want to be kept up to date. For anything else, you can email contact@disabledstudents.co.uk. But we would like to say a very massive thank you to everyone that attended today. It's been a brilliant discussion and we hope to continue the discussion over the summer. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much.